Robert Sherman had always carried hunting in his blood the same way. His father had once passed it down to him, and when his own son Peter turned 10, he felt it was finally the right age to introduce him to the woods in a way that felt more like a rite of passage than just a weekend pastime. On a cool Saturday morning in upstate New York, with the early fog still clinging low between the trees, Robert packed up to rifles, a pair of sandwiches, and the kind of fatherly pride that comes with knowing you're about to teach your child something meaningful. He carried the heavier rifle himself, only handing Peter his own small Remington. Once they found a quiet spot to sit and wait for deer, figuring it would be easier to keep him still if he was holding the weapon he had already practiced with back at home. The first stretch of the hunt was uneventful, long stretches of silence, filled with nothing but rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. And Robert noticed Peter beginning to fidget and sigh in that way only a bored 10-year-old can. And it bothered him because he didn't want his son to see hunting as dull or pointless. Wanting to keep the excitement alive, he decided to move them deeper into the forest. The crunch of their boots over dry leaves echoed softly, until something heavier joined in. Robert instinctively stretched out his arm in front of Peter, signaling him to stop and raise his rifle. But as soon as Robert caught sight of a head peeking from behind a tree in the distance, his heart sank. He quickly lowered Peter's gun with firm pressure, not wanting a mistake, and raised his hand in a half-apologetic wave toward the stranger. The man didn't wave back, didn't speak, didn't even smile. He just slipped back behind the trunk, and for a brief second Robert swore. There was something unsettling about the way his face had looked, though he couldn't quite place what. Hunters did cross paths from time to time, but not like this, not so deep in the woods, not without orange vests or at least some sign of belonging there. Robert's instincts told him to steer Peter in another direction, so he did, trying to keep his voice calm and steady while his mind kept circling back to the odd face. Soon after, Peter began tugging at his sleeve, complaining that he was hungry, and Robert admitted to himself that he was starving too. They stopped to eat, sitting on an old fallen log while Robert unwrapped his sandwich. Just as the comfort of food was easing the tension, the sound of footsteps came again, deliberate and close enough to make the hair on the back of his neck rise. Robert froze mid-bite, his eyes darting toward the same direction as before, and sure enough, there he was, the same man half hidden behind another tree, staring at them in that same motionless way. Robert quickly pushed down Peter's rifle again, and this time even his son seemed unnerved. His earlier excitement drained away. Robert's protective instinct screamed at him to confront the stranger, to demand answers, so he stood up and started marching toward him, though every step felt wrong, like he was exposing himself while his child sat defenseless. Halfway there, he stopped cold, realizing he was about to leave Peter behind, and turned sharply back, telling his son in a hushed but urgent voice that it was time to pack up and go. They began walking toward the road, not running, not wanting to trigger a chase. But Robert's mind was focused on the sound he dreaded most, the twigs snapping behind them. It came, sharp and undeniable, and Robert urged Peter ahead while he spun around, anger flaring through his fear, ready to face the man. Sure enough, the stranger was there again, peering from behind a tree like some predator testing its prey. Robert stormed forward, closing the gap to within 30 feet, when suddenly the man retreated behind the trunk. Robert heard a heavy thud, the unmistakable sound of something dropping to the ground. Rifle raised now, he crept toward the tree with caution, every sense alive. And when he rounded the trunk, his entire world seemed to collapse into a single horrifying image. A human head, severed clean, lying face down on the forest floor with no body anywhere in sight. He didn't check behind the tree, didn't look for footprints or evidence. In that instant, every rational thought dissolved into raw terror. His stomach turned, his chest tightened, and he ran harder than he had in years back toward Peter, yelling for him to move. Together they sprinted through the woods, their lungs burning, until at last the edge of the forest opened to the road. And somehow, miraculously, they made it home within minutes, safe but trembling. That night, Robert didn't sleep, sitting awake with his rifle nearby, every creak of the house sounding like a footstep from the woods. The next morning, his wife quietly told him she had heard on the news that 2 hunters had gone missing in the area, and it was then he knew he couldn't keep silent. He called the police, reported what he had seen, and though the officers promised to investigate, he doubted they could ever truly understand what it felt like to stare down at that head, to know some unseen figure had been close enough to drop it like a calling card. Months passed before he found the courage to take Peter hunting again, and even then, every crack of a branch and every shadow in the trees reminded him of the day. What disturbed him most, what still twists in his mind years later, is not just the gruesome sight, but the chilling thought of how someone could manage to overpower and kill armed hunters without a sound, without leaving a trace. How something like that could happen in the same woods where fathers take their sons to learn patience, discipline, and respect for life. Robert still hunts because it's part of who he is, but he never forgets the stranger's face, the footsteps in the leaves, and the silent warning left at the base of that tree. When I think back to my first hunting trip, I realize it wasn't the animals or even the act of hunting that stuck with me, but the nightmare of what almost happened out there. Something far worse than anything we could have imagined when we packed up for what was supposed to be a fun weekend. I was 21, young enough to still feel pressured by my friends, but old enough to know better. And it was Anthony, my oldest buddy and the most enthusiastic hunter among us, who talked me into going along. He had been on me about it for months, insisting that I needed to experience the real thing. So eventually I said yes, even though I already knew I wasn't going to shoot anything. Along with Anthony, there was Christian, Tom, and Tom's girlfriend Diana. We crammed rifles, tents, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of food into Anthony's truck and drove out to some remote park in Colorado, where he swore elk roamed in abundance. The ride started out fun, everyone laughing and talking, but I grew quieter the closer we got, wrestling with the thought of killing an animal for sport. Anthony kept hyping it up, rattling on about hunting strategies, and at one point I tried joking that he should probably save his breath or risk scaring the animals away, but he didn't laugh. In fact, the way his face hardened told me I had crossed a line. So I kept my doubts to myself from that moment on. When we finally arrived, the parking lot was completely empty, just one cracked patch of asphalt, surrounded by endless trees, and we hiked about a mile in before setting up camp to large tents. Side by side, firewood stacked in a messy pile, and rifles leaning casually against a log. It was supposed to be adventure, and at first it almost felt like that until we ran into them. 3 men, big, dirty, with long, greasy hair and blank eyes that didn't match the friendly nods they gave us as we passed. They looked like they had crawled out of some shack that time forgot, and though nothing was said, the air grew heavy in that moment. Nobody in our group dared to comment until the men were long gone, but we all felt the same unease. The same unspoken question of what 3 strange men were doing this deep in the woods, without so much as a tent or gear in sight. Still, the hunt went on. Anthony eventually killed a deer-no elk. To his disappointment and we dragged it back, watching him and Tom skin and gut the thing in a blur of blood and hands while Diana turned away. And I tried not to gag. Anthony, always prepared, had brought buns and condiments. And by nightfall we were sitting around the fire eating venison burgers, pretending for a brief moment that it was just a normal camping trip. But when the fire died down and we crawled into our tents, the unease came back. Anthony and Christian seemed to fall asleep instantly, but I lay awake, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable. Hours passed, and just when I was considering stepping outside to relieve myself, I heard the crunch of footsteps outside the tent. I froze, debating whether to call out for Tom or Diana, but a sick thought stopped me. What if it wasn't them? The zipper of our tent slid down slowly, and I quickly shut my eyes, pretending to sleep, every nerve in my body on fire. The zipper paused, then went back up, and I listened as the footsteps moved away, toward the other tent. Relieved, I assumed it had been Tom checking on us, maybe Diana sneaking over. And after a few minutes of silence, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I would sneak over to their tent and scare them as payback. I unzipped my tent and crept across the clearing. But when I reached their tent, my stomach turned cold. Their zipper was already undone, wide open. I leaned closer, ready to whisper something stupid and playful. But instead I froze solid. Inside the tent were two of those filthy men we had passed earlier, and they were on top of Diana. For a moment my mind couldn't process it, but then instinct took over and I screamed. Not a brave yell, but a raw, terrified sound that ripped through the camp. Anthony and Christian came crashing out of our tent with rifles in hand, and when the intruders bolted, we recognized them immediately, two of the same men from before. Anthony and Tom fired shots into the dark, not to hit, but to scare, and the night erupted with chaos. From the shadows all around us, from bushes and trees, other figures scattered in different directions, more men, maybe half a dozen or more, who had been hiding, watching, waiting. We were surrounded, and the realization nearly broke me. Diana and Tom were unconscious, and it didn't take long for us to figure out they'd been injected with something, probably tranquilizers, and that thought alone was enough to chill me to the core. For half an hour, we waited, rifles clutched in shaking hands, whispering frantic plans until finally Tom and Diana stirred awake, groggy but alive. Then we ran through the pitch-black forest, branches clawing at our faces, hearts pounding so hard it felt like they might burst. Every step filled with the terror that those men were still out there, chasing us. When the truck finally came into sight, we threw ourselves into it and drove like hell, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they had planned, though I have my dark guesses. Maybe they were part of some secluded, inbred family living off the grid, maybe worse cannibals, predators, who knows? What I do know is that we were lucky. If I hadn't been awake, if I hadn't seen them in that tent, things could have ended very differently. And every time I think about hunting, it isn't the deer or the guns or the woods that come to mind, but that moment when I pulled back the flap of the tent and realized monsters in human skin were already among us. Night hunting had always been my thing, something that set me apart from the average hunter. Because while most people packed up when the sun dipped below the horizon, I found a kind of peace in the silence of the dark woods. Armed with my rifle and a night vision scope, waiting for wild hogs to wander into range. That night started out like many others, calm and uneventful, with me perched in the wooden tower I had built years earlier at the edge of my property, the kind of structure that had weathered storms and seasons but still stood firm, a quiet little fortress above the ground. The air was cool, almost damp, and every sound seemed magnified, the chirp of insects, the occasional crack of branches, but for hours nothing came into my sights. And I was about to give up when something finally moved at the far edge of my scope. My heart skipped, expecting the low silhouette of a hog. But instead the shape that came into focus was tall, upright, undeniably human. It was a man, dressed head to toe in black hoodie pulled up, black sweatpants, black shoes, and he was dragging a sack behind him. Something heavy enough to leave a deep groove in the dirt. As he pulled it along, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't some late-night hiker or lost camper. I was almost certain, judging by the weight of that sack and the way he labored with it, that I was watching someone try to dispose of a body. My first thought was to keep watching, maybe take mental notes for the police. But then he slowed his head, turning ever so slightly upward, and for a split second, I felt his eyes lock onto where I sat hidden in my tower. I ducked instantly, hard hammering, convincing myself there was no way he could actually see me. It was too dark. The tower to conceal, but fear gnawed at me all the same. Seconds dragged like hours until the silence was broken by the unmistakable creak of wood. My stomach dropped. The vibration came through the structure itself, and I realized with dawning horror that the man was climbing my ladder. Every instinct told me to raise my gun and prepare to fire, but the thought of pulling a trigger on another human being froze me. The footsteps rose to planks, then 3, the wood groaning beneath his weight until suddenly they stopped. Then, just as quickly, I heard the heavy thud of him dropping back down and the dragging sound of the sack being pulled away. I stayed crouched low, gripping my rifle so tight my hands ached, barely daring to breathe. And when I finally peeked over the ledge again, the figure was retreating into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I forced myself to wait 10 more agonizing minutes before moving, then scrambled down, every nerve on edge, and flicked on my small flashlight. A mistake, I realize now. Because the beam cut through the woods like a beacon, I didn't care. I needed to get back to the house. I had only been running for seconds when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, rapid and frantic, closing the distance far too quickly. I risked a glance back and nearly tripped when I saw him hood still up, face twisted in rage, barreling toward me, closing in like some nightmare that had broken loose from the dark. Pure instinct saved me. I spun, raised my rifle, and fired, the shot tearing through his shoulder. His scream echoed in the night, raw and furious, but it gave me the chance I needed to sprint the rest of the way home, lungs burning, legs pumping with a desperation I'd never felt before. Inside, with the doors locked, I called the police, my voice trembling as I relayed what had happened. Within 15 minutes, multiple cruisers arrived, lights flashing, officers armed and ready. I led them back into the woods, back to the place where I had taken the shot. Sure enough, a trail of blood painted the leaves, leading us not just to the sack which, horrifyingly, did contain a body but further on to the man himself. He had tried to crawl under a log to hide, clutching his wounded shoulder, but the officers pulled him out, cuffed him, and hauled him away while I stood there shaking, my rifle still clutched in my hand like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Later, I learned the truth. The man had murdered a local shopkeeper, a Japanese corner store owner named Genquin Sakanaki, and I had stumbled right into his attempt to hide the evidence. The police called me lucky, said my shot and quick thinking probably stopped him from escaping and maybe even saved my life. But I didn't feel lucky, I felt haunted. That night burned itself into me. The image of the black-clad figure dragging his grim cargo, the sound of his feet on my ladder, the weight of knowing he was inches away from climbing into my tower. I still hunt, but the woods have never felt the same. Every snap of a twig makes me tense. Every shadow feels like it's hiding someone watching, waiting, testing. And though I survived, though justice was served, part of me will always be up in that tower, crouched low, praying the man in black would keep walking, praying the nightmare would pass me by.